Assalamu alaikum. Hello everyone, this is Hussein Bouhouch from English PZ. Today's lecture will be about postcolonial studies. First, hello students, I hope you are all doing great. Let's move on نمشيو نشرحو postcolonial studies model. Course objective first of all. في هذا الكورس عندنا students will become aware with major issues of postcolonial studies throughout its founding fathers and theoretical conception of this field of study. Through this introductory, students will have a background information about postcolonialism in many ways, in several ways, for example, literature and culture, and so on. Basically, عندنا reading materials for our university, of course, Ibn Zohri University, Agadir. We have these materials for references. We have the first one, Orientalism by Edward Said, the second one, The Empire Writes Back by Gary Griffiths and Bill Ashcroft and Helen, etc. The third book, Postcolonial Studies, the Key Concepts, also by the same authors, by Bill Ashcroft and Gary Griffiths. And the fourth one, the last one, which is about literary genre, literary text, colonial text by Daniel Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Of course, for other universities, they have the same tendencies, which is post-colonial approach. For example, in many universities كاين عندهم African literature كيدرسوا في novel. We can say, for example, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born by Kwame, or we can say كاينين عاوتاني other universities كاي عندهم travel narrative اللي فيه Journey into Barbary by Lewis, for example, or in Morocco, wherever. المهم it depends. Others كاين عندهم كيدرسوا Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. It depends, but اللي عندهم واحد relationship اللي هي postcolonial studies. Let's move on. هاد البوكس basically هاد Empire Writes Back by Bill Ashcroft, Gary Griffiths, Helen Telfin. It deals generally and fundamentally it deals with post-colonial literature. How does post-colonial literature was merged, and the relationship between post-colonial literature with colonizers, and also with English studies, English language. Basically, that's the main idea. The book of Edward Said اللي published في 1978, we can say that اللي سميتو Orientalism, we can say that it's هو اللي فتح البوابة ديال post-colonial approach to be recognized في 1980. في 1980s يلا بدأت الابروتش ديال postcolonial studies academically. يلا كيشوفوها historians intellectuals basically. في هذا البوك Edward Said he tried to emerge a new field by decentering the West, not subjectively but objectively. حيت جمع فيه a lot of theories, a lot of topics and concepts. For example, دخل فيه the concept of Michel Foucault discourse, ودخل فيه the concept of consent, hegemonic power by Antonio Gramsci, وفي عاوتاني geographically ندخل فيه بزاف ديال concepts which are fundamental concerned with dealing with post-colonial issues, or what can we say is post-colonial crisis, for example. The third book, اللي هو Postcolonial Studies, the Key Concepts, the same by the same authors, اللي هو by Bill Ashcroft, Gary Griffiths and Helen Telfin. هذا فيه generally concepts. تلقى فيه concepts ديال postcolonial studies, for example hybridity, ambivalence, otherness, the other, self, west, the east, basically like this. The last one, which is a novel, literary text by Daniel Defoe, اسمها روبنسون كروزو. هذا النوvel it deals with colonial literature. It is colonial literature. It deals with the protagonist, the main character, اللي تحط في واحد الجزيرة after a shipwreck. وقع لي واحد انهيار في السفينة، واحد الشيبريك، وتحط في واحد الايلاند بوحدو، وتماك خصو يدير ديك الميشن، ديك الوايت مان بيردن اللي كنسميوها از روديارد كيبلين اللي دار عليها البويم الوايت مان بيردن، اللي هي واحد الميشن خصو يديرها از نيسيسيتي، از نوبل ميشن، نوبل اوبليغيشن، اللي هي سيفيلايزيشن ميشن، ولا لا ميسيون سيفيليزاتريس بحال هكا. It deals with how does he subjugated the other in general, اللي هو Friday. He shaped his mindset throughout religion and many things. And let's go on now. First, what is postcolonial studies? Postcolonialism is a critical theory, analysis of the history, culture, literature, and discourse of European imperial power. That's the main idea of postcolonialism. So why postcolonialism? During this time, why does postcolonialism emerge as a theory? Why? It was emerged because it was a necessity for the colonized, the oppressed people, citizens, to voice for their own culture and for their own civilization. Postcolonialism claims the right of all people on this earth to the same material and cultural well-being. في الإيرا ديال الكولونياليزم اللي for example Africa when وقع لها colonization, it was basically استعمرت على حساب ما عندهاش هي. أفريقيا ما عندهاش no culture, no religion, no ethics, no values, so it is just a piece geographically, and we should benefit from it and we should colonize it. هادشي اللي وقع ليهم. And in fact it is not, it is just a prejudice. That's the whole thing. Let's go now by concepts and definitions. Concepts and definitions deal post-colonial approach. First of all, كاينه واحد الكونسيبت سميتها pre-colonial. Before colonialism, before colonial era, سميتها pre-colonial. هاد البري-colonial وقع فيها واحد البلان ديال سبانيش اللي هي ولات عندها ديك السوفرنيتي، اللي عندها ديك اللي ولات سبانيش كونتري عندها ديك السوفرنيتي. For example, when Philip, the King Philip the second, استعمر Philippines Asian countries. وهذا الشيء وبيفور even Spanish كانت ديك الإمبراطورية العثمانية Ottoman Empire كانت استمرت like the most Arab countries. ولكن وقع لها في واحد البيريود ديال الرينيسانس ديكلاين. صافي ديك الديكلاين جات after it جات British Empire وخدات هاد الإيشيو ديال Ottoman Empire, and she takes this chance to colonize and subjugate the other nations. Colonial era هي colonial era after the announcement of Elizabeth في 15th century. ولا كان واحد الانونس Elizabeth the Queen, she was interested with products, for example resources, and thus she announced that everyone should look for a new piece of location, or what we call geographic place, that has something beneficial, resources, materials. That's why Christopher Columbus went to America and he discovered other nations there. That's why it's called the age of exploitation. That's the main issue. And at this time, most of Africa hadn't been discovered. Because of what? It hadn't been discovered yet. Since Europeans, they have this fear, or this concept of the fear from the unknown, or the fear from the other. That's why the West it started to civilize the East, because it has this tendency, this fear of the other. We can see like the rise of the Ottoman Empire, or we can see after the Dark Ages. The Westerns ما بقاوش يبقى لهم مشكلة عليهم هذا البروبلم ديال الدارك ايجز. وصلوا واحد المرحلة ديال الانحطاط which is horrible, catastrophic for the Westerners. ما بقاوش يعاودوا هاد الكرايسيس اللي وقع لهم في الويست. That's why صيفطوا من القرن الخامس عشر للقرن السابع عشر اللي كنسميو Enlightenment and Renaissance era. صيفطوا a lot of travelers to the east. يعني Arab countries. وتماك هاد travelers كنسميهم Orientalists. بداو كياخدوا علينا our culture, our things, our tradition, our customs, our beliefs. We had all of these things, they were reported and they were sent to Europe, which means the Westerners or the Europe عندهم ديك superiority of knowledge over us, حيت هما بداو كيسرقوا منا our science, for example. In fact, واحد example ديال Arab fairy tales, the myths استفدوا بزاف في literary genre. خداو من عندنا translation, for example, translation 1001 night, ألف ليلة وليلة, واستفدوا من الترجمة itself. خداو عندنا the methods of translation, and even after another example is في the Moorish, or you can say في ديك الإيرا ديال العصر الأندلس, a lot of countries they were like in Spanish, but they were under control of the Muslims. لكن وقع عليهم واحد even Muslims وقع عليهم واحد الجاب, we can see واحد الكرايسيس تاعهم, واحد المشكلة, وخرجوا منها because of Christian missionaries. بديك الحملات الصليبية المسلمين خرجوا من الأندلس, ولكن the same way دخلوها first as Muslims, but خرجوها as many ethnicities or many diverse cultural minorities. خرجوا منها أمويين, الأمويين, المرابطين, الموحدين. هادشي اللي وقع, اللي هي واحد التيوري داروها الويسترنرز divide and rule اللي كتسمى عندنا بالمثل ديالنا فرق تسود. هنا هذا كنسميو sustained theory, يعني شي حاجة it was already programmed or planned for decades or for ages or for years. هذا هو the meaning of sustained. Now let's go on to colonialism. هذه هي concept ديال colonialism. Colonialism هي the practical side. after هاد travelers خداو عندنا our knowledge, our things, وعندهم داك knowledge over us عرفوا our weakest point. بداو colonialism bit by bit. بداو firstly by announcing Christian missionaries. بداو كيطلقوا ديك الحملات الصليبيه وديك في افريقيا وبداو عاوتاني كي announcing واحد الكونسيبت اللي سميتها civilization mission ولا لا ميسيون civilisatrice as a philanthropic way ولا as a humanitarian way to help people hit because they think themselves as Eurocentric or as ethnocentric, the Westerners, and the other is uncivilized or backward, based on their binary opposition, which is obviously invalid or incorrect. After launching these concepts, as I said, Christian missionary civilization mission, but inside of this concept it has some tinge of evil, like there was violence there was murder, a lot of things, catastrophes, a lot of things are horrible there and miserable for the colonized. It was violence was occupied, and violence was the first way to subjugate the other or the colonized nation. That's why postcolonialism emerged as a theory and had returning the gaze, writing back to claim their rights because they were violent, they were repressed, and they were oppressed at the same time. صافي عندهم they were like because وقع الفايلنس وقع واحد النهب الثروات ديالهم gold and everything, especially في concept اللي كنسميوها scramble of Africa اللي دارت I think 1895 the late of 19th century. عندهم had scramble of Africa after they had been discovered this first Africa in Renaissance era. Much of it hadn't been discovered, as I said before, but after 19th century a lot of invaders and orientalists went to Africa to study, to investigate it, and what they found is it is wealthful. It has wealth, gold mine and jewelries and everything. That's why a lot of Western countries, for example French, Spanish, I can say British, they are starving for this continent of Africa. That's why they were even ready to start war between the Western nation countries, between them. That's why they created this conference of scramble of Africa, and they separate Africa between them, between France and Spanish and British as a piece of cake. Like this place is yours, and this place is mine. It was that's why we call it scramble of Africa. This postcolonialism خرج على هذا scramble of Africa. For example, we can say the first one خرج على postcolonialism. We can see Franz Fanon اللي هو في 1960. He is a psychiatrist, so he is a Kenyan. دار واحد البوك سميتو The Rich Leave the Earth, and even another book Black Skin White Mask. كيدرس فيه الأونتولوجي يعني الرياليتي ديال colonized one, especially the race. He tackles the race يعني هو العرق. especially Africans, they were dehumanized, and they were dehumanized based on basic assumptions, on generic assumptions that were false. For example, you can say they were the Africans, they were like uncivilized, backward, they have no religion, they have no culture, they are based on scientific discoveries and biological. You can say this theory of Darwinist theory, or you can say butterfly theory. The black skin is inferior to the white skin, to the white race. That's why they started justifying their own missionary of civilizing the other. Even after, before post-colonial, there were like thoughts, a lot of thoughts that were discussed in European counter civilization, Western civilization or Western tradition. We can say in 1966 خرج جاك ديريدا, an Algerian French philosopher, خرج بواحد theory اللي هي post-structuralism deconstruction. Post-structuralism deconstruction, it was way decentering the West, the basic tendencies ديال the West. For example, he tackles this issue of logocentrism, the issue of phonocentrism, and the issue of binary opposition. He said that most of the West take themselves ethnocentrically, or ethnocentrism, this concept of ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism, that the West is superior over the other, religiously, culturally, and politically, and economically. This way of seeing the world, or the ontologically, جاك ديريدا دار ليها واحد decentering or deconstruct. He besmirched these basic assumption ديال the West. He's مشارجع dialogues ديال Plato. Plato ملي كان عنده ديك speech is overwriting, يعني هذه واحد التندنسي ديال for example philosophy over literature, man over women. This were the basic fundamental things the Westerners considered. For example, speech over writing, that was the theory of Plato, and Derrida deconstructed, and based on this deconstruction, it appeared later on in, I think, in 1940s, this concept, this topic of decolonial thought, what we call decolonialism. These decolonial thought, they were silent. It was with many philosophers. For example, we can take Michel Foucault, we can take Jacques Derrida himself, of course, and there is also Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. These are philosophers and intellectuals at the same time, French philosophers. And there is also this Jewish French ethical philosopher, which was known as by his this theory of the faith, Thou shalt not kill. Emmanuel Levinas. He was defending the race, or the humanitarian help. He thinks that the identity of the other should be respected as it is, yani seeing oneself in the other. Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, all of their writings about colonialism, it is under silent, which means it was like there is an absence of colonialism and post-colonial thought. Even Michel Foucault tackles a lot of topics: governmentality, biopolitics, power knowledge, discourse. But he didn't say it generally. He tackles these concepts by silent. Later on, with the appearance of Edward Said, he take these concepts of Michel Foucault specifically, and he translates it, and he tries to invent a book which will successfully decenter the West. But later on, even his book Orientalism, he was heavily criticized by the Westerners and even the Easterners. That was the main issue of postcolonialism as a theory. This concept, the following concept, which was neocolonialism, we can say that it is a new way of colonizing the other. It was from direct rule to indirect, which means politically and economically. What do you mean by politically and economically? It is the imperialism. Colonialism was based on violence and also at economy. But within this concept of new colonialism, it was directly emerged indirectly under the structure which is oppressed and repressed, but it has its power through politics and economy and many other fields of study academically itself. We can discuss this issue of neocolonialism. For example, you can find a lot of writers, a lot of post-colonial writers, for example, Aimé Césaire, or you can say Ngugi Thiong'o, Decolonizing the Mind, or even Naples, still rewriting. It is as a product of returning the gaze, but it has not been recognized by the Westerners because they take this privilege that they have, this tendency of language, English language, it's basically not for the colonized ones, it is for the native, it serves the native. Thus a lot of post-colonial writers, they were silent and they were oppressed by this violence, epistemic violence. This concept of transculturalism, it is new, it is a recent field of study. It was first coined by Ortiz, which he mean that transculturalism, it's not based on binary opposition, West and the East, civilized and uncivilized. Like we have overcome this problem. We have transmit to another generation, which is digital humanities, or what we call globalization, digital globalization, which we can say that we are already hybrid, as the concept of Homi Bhabha in his book The Education of Culture. This hybridity, its consequences, it's inventing a new transcultural reality, which means that all the Westerners and the Easterners, even all the citizens, what we call multiculturalism, and even cultural diversities, they were all mingled and mixed and hybrid. So there is no origin to go back. Let's go to tackle this holy trinity of postcolonial studies, which means the founding fathers of postcolonial field. The first one is Edward Said. Edward Said, he was Palestinian American writer and also a Christian. He has three books: Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism and the Representation of Intellectuals. Mostly and fundamentally, he tackles this issue of binary opposition. That the Westerners takes the privilege over the Easterners, like West and the non-West, civilized, non-civilized. It has this tendency: high, low, good, evil, the self, the other. He also tackles this issue of representation. It takes this representation as a way of misrepresentation the East. For him, the Orientalists misrepresent the Easterners as a whole. The Orient, as we can say, the Occident misrepresents the Orient. In his book Orientalism, he was criticizing, not criticizing, but describing this issue of representation. That representation it was made by the Orientalists as an organized science, which means based on power knowledge paradigm. That knowledge is power. It serves the Westerners. What do you mean by this? It's like we are still studying, for example, these post-colonial issues by using the Western style, by using topics, concepts, statements, for example, concepts by philosophers, Western philosophers like discourse, like hegemony by Machiavellian system. All of these concepts are basically invented and created by Westerners, not Easterners, and that's why he thinks that the Easterners should have a voice, this post-colonial voice that was aiming for. The second one, Homi Bhabha. Homi Bhabha is known for his concept of hybridity and ambivalence, and also cultural identity, what you call, and also agency. He tackles this issue of hybridity. He says the Westerners takes the Easterner, which means the non-Western people or the colonized, as themselves, as a strategy. In his writing, he wrote once, the same but not quite, which means this is a process of hybridity, mimicry. He has a concept of mimicry, mimicking or imitating the Westerners, like in style, in clothes, in food, in whatever. The same but not quite, even in English, in pronouncing words, the same but not quite. It has this mimicry creates an ambivalence, as he said, putting the colonized in a third space. He has a book known as The Location of Culture. He was published in 1994, I think. Yeah. The third one is Gayatri Spivak. She is also known as postcolonial feminist. She has this book, Can the Subaltern Speak? Which means can the subaltern voice for himself? As Marx said, they cannot be represented. They cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. That was the main issue for Gayatri Spivak to investigate through. She was following, by the way, the post-structuralist deconstruction theory of Derrida. And Homi Bhabha himself, he was interested in Jacques Lacan's theory, Jacques Lacan's writing. That's why mostly when reading his books, you can find this abstraction in his writing. You can now grasp the meaning of what he's saying. Edward Said, he was inspired by Michel Foucault, fundamentally, but at a point he criticized Michel Foucault because Michel Foucault is anti-humanist and Edward Said is a humanistic philosopher. For example, if you want to read other materials, you can have this book, Black Skin, White Mask, by Franz Fanon. It is an interesting book, an amazing book that you can understand this theoretical framework, theoretical background of colonialism and also post-colonialism, since he is comparing with the colonial and the post-colonial condition. The second book is also by Edward Said, Culture and Imperialism. It tackles this issue of cultural diversities, cultural minorities, imperialism. It also tackles colonization and the way of legitimization, many aspects in society of what he's saying, culture as a whole. That was my lecture for today. I hope you got the session very good. Thank you so much. See you next week.